Welcome to LIFICAST, the official companion podcast of the Leeds International Festival of Ideas. My name is Larry Budd, I'm one of the team here at the festival itself and at Welcome to Leeds. This year, LIFI covers topics as broad as addiction, war reporting and gut biomes. But whatever the subject, the festival concerns itself with one thing: how ideas might affect the future of humanity, which, depending on who you speak to, is either very bright or very, very, very dark. This year marks 40 years since 1984 and 75 years since George Orwell published 1984. So that's why LIFICAST is exploring the idea of our dystopian future. In this episode, we'll explore the rise of authoritarianism and the methods used by various governments to maintain control. We'll delve into the political, economic and surveillance tactics that underpin authoritarian regimes. With us here on this episode, episode 1, are Professor Susan Watkins, a Professor of Women's Writing at Leeds Beckett University with particular research interests in dystopia, apocalyptic fiction and the future. And Dr. Jack Simpson, Visiting Lecturer at the University of Leeds and owner of Hyde Park Book Club as well. Nice to have you both on. Thank you for coming. If I could start, Susan, let's start with you and just talk to us about your work and how you describe what you do at this point.
Okay. Well, I'm interested in women's writing, as you mentioned in the intro. And so a lot of what I do is looking at how women writers have developed some of the more classic dystopias of mid-20th century. Obviously, things like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and the sequel, The Testaments. But beyond that, to some more recent reproductive dystopias, perhaps slightly more interesting works by people from different backgrounds, looking at reproductive rights and sexuality and gender identity, all in terms of how governments and future societies might want to get involved in that, really, and start legislating around and influencing individual freedoms in those areas. But I also teach my students, you know, the classic stuff, 1984, Brave New World, A Clockwork Orange. So we sort of start mid-century with that outpouring of dystopian fiction that everybody sort of thinks of, and then we come up right up to date. Yeah.
There's so much already there that I just want to talk about for hours on end, but we'll get to that in a moment. We'll allow Jack to say what you're doing at this moment, Jack, and how the work that you've done and the stuff that you've written ties into what our future looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So I primarily use a framework called the capability approach, which is concerned with ideas around human development and how we evaluate how individuals are doing, how societies are doing, and it's often situated within cities. And in terms of links to the subjects we'll talk about today, I guess I'm interested in how globalization, how technology have affected the kinds of lives people are able to live in cities, the way that it's become easier and easier for people outside of a situation to control the conditions of a kind of local situation.
Okay, fantastic. So we're talking about authoritarianism, totalitarianism, government control in a dystopian future. Many people, me included, I have to say, I sort of, if I look on Twitter in the morning, I sort of then am fearful for the rest of the day about what is coming in our immediate, in November, never mind what might come in the next 10 years. What's your general view at the moment, Susan? Do you fear for the future in the same way some people do? Are all these things from the books you just mentioned, are they all coming true?
I have mixed views. I'm a big fence sitter, I'm afraid to say. So I do have a lot of fears. And one of the big ones is around reproductive freedoms, specifically in the US, because I mean, the overturning of Roe v. Wade is a big one, which Atwood on Twitter then said, you know, I predicted this, and that got a bit of a backlash because she sort of maybe looked a little bit smug. But I think those are the areas where, particularly for me, as someone who advocates for feminism, I'm sort of particularly concerned. But yeah, broad other areas, you know, surveillance, privacy, ideas about privacy, massively transformed in the last, 20 years, 10 years even. And of course, the pandemic, you know, that I think showed how vulnerable our social networks are, and how ideas about nationalism, for example, are completely redundant when you've got a pandemic that can spread across borders. So, yeah, I'm concerned about all those things. But I'm also hopeful about writing. I think there's a lot of hope that writing offers in the way that it can challenge, the way that it can get people to think. That's why I teach and study literature, because I think that's what it can do, and that's why it's important.
Yeah. Jack, do you sort of wake up sweating every morning, worried about the future, or have you got cause for hope through your own work?
Yeah, I think I also am a fence sitter. So I think...
Just me scared then. Just fence sitters and a fearful man.
I think, I was listening to Yuval Noah Harari this morning, just partly as I was thinking about this, and he was talking about a potential for AI to develop a financial system that we don't understand. So you could have a kind of crisis in the economy that no human not only understands how to solve, but doesn't really understand what's happened. And I think my big fears right now are linked to humans' ability to have a sense that their perception of the world in any way relates to the same kind of perception that other people live in. I guess if you look at the great successes of the last 100 years or so, you look at, I don't know, the NHS in the UK or comprehensive education, these kind of things, they kind of rely on us having a sense that we live in the same world and that I have some kind of obligation towards you. And I think once we start entering a space where people have such a curated idea of what's happening in the world, and both their own interests can be fed back to them as somehow some kind of truth about the world and unchallenged. But also when you look at who is in control of these things, right? So it's like a very small number of people are at the cutting edge of technology, and a very small number of people control most of the capital in the world. And when you have these slightly utopian ideas that, well, we're all going to be able to kind of work not very much. I think you just look back at the last, 150 years. I mean, are people working radically less? People are probably working less than they were, like working people. But, certainly the spoils of the last 40, 50 years have not been distributed in order to kind of raise humankind as much as they could have been. So yeah, they're my concerns really, that a small number of people are going to have a really disproportionate say in what happens with capital, but also in the reality that other people live in. So Daniel Dennett has this thing where he talks about free will, and he says, look, kind of people talk about free will as if it's something that dogs have or humans have or trees have or don't have. And he says, look, when you look back at certain totalitarian regimes, there is a way of internalizing fears and possibilities that humans feel like they have, in a way that you can absolutely say that people in certain kind of communist or Nazi environments didn't have total free will. And I think when you look at what Instagram, say, does to people in the West, there were causes for thinking similar things are going on there.
Yeah, interesting, because there's the two discussions about free will. One, does it exist on a scientific level that Sam Harris talks about, and then the Dan Dennett thing that you mentioned there. Were you alluding to this idea that some people worry about, that a population that doesn't know what truth is or can't agree on what a fact is a population on the way to one that's being fully controlled by the people who have put those ideas in their heads in the first place? This is sort of a complaint you get online, isn't it? That none of us know what truth is anymore. None of us know what is actually happening. And in an odd way, that makes us far more easily controlled, apart from almost a fringe who are dismissed as, crack jobs or, conspiracy theorists, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a natural skeptic when it comes to knowledge, right? I've never been to Australia. Does it exist? Like, I've kind of reason to think it exists.
I've not been either, so, you're not going to get any proof.
And also, I've been to France, but did I really go to France? So, like, on some, like, deep philosophical level, I am really sympathetic to people that are really kind of skeptical about knowledge. But then, I was talking to a friend about the Trump election, about whether it was kind of rigged and this kind of stuff. And she kind of like, she knows that I'm a natural kind of skeptic about knowledge. So she's like, well, you don't know that Trump didn't win that election. And so I have to admit, well, no, I didn't. And I think most people that are honest can say, well, look, I don't really know what's going on in kind of like Chinese politics or this or that. But when we enter a space where Joe2794's YouTube account is seen as legitimate as the BBC, then we're in trouble. But I also think that it's not wholly unhealthy for people to come to a point where they think, actually, what is Sky News' agenda? When you hear about wars that have been waged by the West, like, should I really take the BBC's account? So it's difficult. I think some of the skepticism is healthy, but we've reached this kind of almost nihilism where, like, anybody's opinion is fine, and that feels problematic.
Yeah, I love that YouTube channel, by the way, Joe4297. I get all of my thoughts from there. Susan, this is one for you. I find the modern political discourse interesting from the point of view that you have people on both extremes who both say that the others are planning some sort of totalitarian control. Whether that's the right-wing style of control, if you like, so the religio-fascism, the sort of control over women's bodies that you were talking about, or the left-wing version with the control over speech or whatever else they're accused of. Is there one to fear more than the other? Does one exist more than the other? What's your view on that?
I think they mirror each other. I don't know if people have come across Naomi Klein's book Doppelganger. It's a really good assessment of how it starts with the fact that she was always being mixed up with the other Naomi, who's also a writer, but has shifted to the far right, and then it moves from that to the idea that doubling is a thing that we see happening across culture, politics, society. I think her assessment is that it's the doubling that's the problem. It's the fact that we always other views that are uncongenial to our own, and that we're not prepared to entertain or converse with those who espouse different opinions. And for me, I think that's the concerning thing. It's not about, I mean, obviously, I'm not in favor of right-wing totalitarianism or far-right ideology, but I don't think we can exist in a situation where there's zero conversation. And so I think that, again, it's about discourse, it's about engagement, and that has to be something that we work towards in order to avoid, being in these sort of parallel lines that never meet.
So that leads on to a huge question here, which we're going to need you to solve right now.
Okay, I'll try my best.
You've got someone who is, might call themselves a classical liberal, or somebody who considers that they're taking on arguments and they consider themselves to be fairly liberal and maybe faintly progressive along with it. And they will go into a discussion then with Tommy Robinson over here, and they will go in and say, I'm going to have a good faith debate with Tommy Robinson on what he thinks about X, Y, and Z. When that doesn't come back the other way, because good faith arguments are not had in quite often, they're not in two directions, are they?
Yeah.
How do you have that conversation?
One liberal person go and speak in an environment where you're the only person in that environment. So I think if you're going to have a conversation, it has to be on terms where there are multiple voices. So, if the equivalent of Tommy Robinson is setting an agenda where you're being set up to fail, then I think, it's legitimate to just say, no, I'm not taking part in this. But I think, broadly speaking, the sort of the dialogue, the discourse has to be there, because there has to be a sort of a space in which to debate these ideas. The distinction that people often draw in fiction is between the sort of classical dystopia where everything's terrible and there's no positive element whatsoever, and what they call the critical dystopia, where there's some positive hope within the text itself. And I think that notion of critical perspective is really important.
Jack, I wanted to talk about warning signs or things that we see in society today that might make you go, is that something that could be problematic down the line? I wondered as well on the way in today, I was thinking about cashless society, for example. Now, if you're someone who was worried about being controlled by a government or powers, then cash is something that's on your mind, yet it's in bars in Leeds, for example, where you can't buy a pint with a five. Well, you can't buy a pint with a fiver anyway these days, can you? It's, it's at least £6 or £7. But it's you can't use cash to pay in some bars, and that seems like a good idea. It's protecting the staff. There's fewer robberies. It's easier. It's more convenient. But there's a dark side to that some people might get really worried about. Are these warning signs to look out for? Or am I overthinking it?
No, I think they're definitely warning signs. And I think, a lot of it asks, what kind of trust do we have in the people that are organising society? And I think some work has got to be done on that side. I mean, you even see it with this recent Labour government, that there are not great talks about hope for the future, right? Labour have continued this idea that, actually everything's terrible and we're all going to have to suffer. And so to some extent, if I was in a very cash heavy, if I was a taxi driver, I think I might question, well, I've seen where the contracts went for COVID. Where does this money go that I'm paying towards the government? At the same time, I think, if you look at, often we talk about kind of the state of nature as this totally free, theoretical state that humans would be in if we didn't have to abide by laws. And to some extent, most people seem to think that, well, look, there are certain compromises you make to live in a kind of civil society. And that does mean that you might not be able to take the chemicals that you want to take, or to drive as fast as you want to drive, or you might have to have a kind of seatbelt. But there's a payoff, and in return, you're on streets where people are not driving as fast as they want. So I think to some extent, I don't think people having to buy into a single system is terrible, but it is partly dependent on who is leading that system. And again, not to get too Marxist too much, but I think that it's not unreasonable of people to look around the world and think that, well, look, maybe, capital is having too much influence on governments. And I think where a lot of the issues that we're talking about come from is that the internet, for the first time, obviously we've had various phases of globalization, but we've not really had a space that is truly global, that doesn't, that national governments are trying to work out, how do we work with this? And you have things like cryptocurrencies. So in some sense, you can see this as a pursuit of a kind of single human community. But then there are these rows really about, well, who gets to set the moral norms, right? So that's what I'd see from the left is, or aspects of the left would be at times extremely intolerant of things that they feel are morally impermissible. So it's kind of reasonable to understand why they are. But I think what you were saying really, like, we need to, in a rapidly globalizing situation, you need to be able to live with people who've got very different ideas of what the world should be. And I think you look at whether it's kind of Islam or neoliberalism, the one issue might be that there is a battle for the dominant ideology, and there's a lot of kickback against that. So either we're heading towards, I guess, when countries like England came together, there will have been different kind of fiefdoms with different moral norms about what you do with buried people, or when you're burying people, and all these kind of things. But we're just having that with 7 billion people. And yeah, I think most humans are just not really prepared to put something out there that is going to be critiqued by people that have no goodwill towards them and have no real interest in a relationship with them tomorrow. So I can kind of say what I want. And that feels like it's breaking down to me that society needs a level of trust and kind of bonhomie to work. And the internet just isn't really built for that right now.
Yeah. So switch it off. Is that what you're saying?
So just switch it off and on again. Yeah.
I don't know who it was who said that it's the greatest psychological experiment ever carried out on the greatest number of people, and there are no controls, and we simply don't know what's going to happen.
I think the worrying, it's because of, dealing with students as we do, I think it's the effect on young people that concerns me in particular, because growing up now with it there from the word go, photographs as a baby, as a child, then you get your phone at secondary school. It's deeply disturbing to me that it's forming people's identity before they even have one. in a way that I think is a big shift. I mean, okay, there have been shifts previously, you know, print culture, massive shift, phones, television, radio, they're all media shifts. But I think the intimacy at a very young age is something that we should all be concerned about.
Mm-hmm. The identity thing's fascinating because you know, not only is it forming identities, but it's also saying you need to know what your identity is and you need to stick with it and you need to fight for it.
That's a good point.
You know, I'm 44 and I still don't know who I am really, you know.
Yeah, so there's a certain inability to be flexible, despite the fact that actually maybe there's lip service paid to the idea that identity can be flexible.
Yeah,
and particularly for women, I think it's tough, you know, to be seeing what you're supposed to look like the whole time. I mean, that must be dire.
Yeah, and the sense of kind of permanence, right? You see, who was the cricketer that went on to bat for the first time for England, and while he was on, someone leaked some tweets from when he was 14.
Yeah,
Ollie Robbins.
Yeah, and
so there's
watching him bat, not knowing this had happened. But these things are, you know, who hasn't said stupid things at 14?
Right.
God, I'm glad it wasn't there when I was that age. You know, it just wasn't the social media aspect wasn't an option.
Yeah.
You know, and it is all of that's a bit terrifying, and who knows where that will go. But I want to talk about surveillance because it's tied into that, and I want to talk about control because I think most people might go about their daily lives and not really think about individual freedoms. It might crop up if you're told you can't have a drink outside, or you know, and we've got used to restrictions through COVID or what they might look like after the pandemic. How do totalitarian regimes, and you might pick from fiction or you might pick from some historical example here, how do they go about suppressing freedom? I assume it's not just a sort of, right now, today you have no freedoms. It's a creep, I imagine. And where does that start, and what should we be looking for? What should we be worried about, if indeed we are the type to worry?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, I'm thinking in literature, you're often immersed into regimes that already exist. So you don't actually see the formative phases. But I think explicit violence, definitely lots of forms of surveillance, lots of forms of internalized surveillance, which is closer to what we get now. I mean, Foucault comes up with the idea of the panopticon. Well, he comes up with it as a theoretical framework. The panopticon comes from Jeremy Bentham's idea that if you design a prison or a hospital or a school with a central space in the middle where the guard or person who runs the place could be located, and then everyone, all the prisoners or inhabitants or whatever, are in individual cells around the outside, but they can't see if they're being watched or not. So they have to assume they're being watched all the time because they don't know if they are or not. That is the model of sort of surveillance society that is sort of emerging in Bentham's modelling of it in the 18th century. And then Foucault takes it, who's a French philosopher, he takes it as this model for how modern society works. And I think the idea is that if we've all internalised the sense that someone could be watching us all the time, then our freedoms are already curtailed before we even, we can't even verbalise them necessarily. So surveillance society, I think, is one of the big things to be concerned about. Surveillance capitalism is particularly concerning, the selling of information about us from our phones and from our social media interactions, etc. I mean, a really good account of this is Edward Snowden's memoir, The Guy Who Sold All the Stuff to Wikipedia. Yeah. And his memoir is really good on the sort of technical side of it and how those freedoms were sold because of really arcane laws about old-fashioned phones in the US, many, many years ago, before we even knew what was happening. So I think it's sort of through those methods, but also through how we all internalize ideas about what we should look like, how we should behave, how we should interact with each other in terms of sexuality, for example. Everything. It's sort of deeply, deeply seated in our sense of who we are.
So interesting that the surveillance that you talk about is so interesting, isn't it, Jack? That surveillance isn't just a camera on a street.
Yeah.
That there's we almost self-surveil, don't we? You know, we take pictures of ourselves. This is where I am this week, and you know, and this is where I'm driving. Google Maps will tell you where you've been, where you are. Do you think people sort of realize what they're giving away in that sense? Again, I think even asking the question, I sort of worry whether I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but we do give a huge amount of data away.
Yeah, I think that's one of the crazy things. You know, if you were at Google, that people pay to have a, you know, Alexa or whatever in their house. That, I mean, that is the kind of strange, really kind of odd thing, you know, when you think about it kind of from a Foucauldian point of view, is that it's not that we're being followed around, it's that we're kind of almost asking to participate in this, right? So we're kind of putting on Instagram, we're putting, I mean, maybe not now on Facebook, but, you know, I've checked into wherever, and all our data is kind of out there, really. I mean, I guess I also think, and that being a realist about it, whether it was the pharaohs or it was the kind of Roman Empire, I think that all powerful entities will have used whatever they could to keep track of people. And so the difficulty with the internet is like, you know, what do we do to stop that? You saw with the kind of like NSA and stuff like that, they are just surveying people, right? And I think maybe our generation at least probably goes into having a mobile phone with, or maybe it's because I grew up in a kind of slightly neurotic left-wing household, but I grew in just expecting that it now is following everything I'm doing, and that, you know, even in the early days of the internet, like Father Time, but, you know, I didn't search for certain things if I was like, I don't really want my phone to know that I'm thinking about this. So I think that's the difficulty as well when it comes to younger people, is they're kind of natives to this, and so for them, it's maybe like the post or the home phone to us. I don't think they'll go in with the same skepticism. Well, I mean, we're probably a bit of a strange generation, really, in that people 20 years older probably don't have to do too much. You don't have to live their lives as much as we do. And then people 20 years younger are just kind of born to it, really. So maybe there's something a bit useful about our generation in that we are probably the last people to remember having a childhood that wasn't super impacted by the internet.
Yeah.
But I've also been in situations where people have said, well, what's wrong with it if you're not doing anything wrong? You know, and it's actually quite difficult to answer that question. If you've got someone saying, well, you know, I'm not bothered if there's CCTV and if my phone's watching me and all that stuff, because I'm not doing anything wrong and it's keeping me safe. What actually is the counter answer to that?
Well, I think the thing is you know, the best paid psychologists in the world and the most amount of capital is, you know, held within a handful of companies that have a super interest in knowing your preferences in order to sell you things. You know, I mean, you know, generally look at, I guess, big pharmaceutical companies. I mean, how incentivized are they for you not to be anxious, right? So when you bring these companies together, like actually you being a bit on edge, or you being triggered by, you know, if you're kind of generally triggered by, maybe you're a BLM supporter. If your feed is just generally kind of like nice progressive stuff, like how much time are you going to spend online? How many adverts are you going to see? If you kind of keep getting sent things by people, right-wing people, and being agitated. So I think that's the thing, is like your data and who you are is valuable partly for knowing what to nudge you towards. And that probably isn't in your interest. So I think that's the worry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Tristan Harris, who was one of the architects of the Google City Plaza or something, which is how they sort of described the search engine in the early days. He sort of escaped from that. I think he considers himself a survivor of sorts, but he talked about how the whole algorithm works. It defines your personality. It figures out your personality type. It figures out what it needs for you to stay on the site for longer. So for me, it's outrage. So if I go on to X, it shows me Elon Musk, it shows me Donald Trump, because it knows I'll stay and I'll engage and I'll get across. You know, so I'm one of those people that said, right, I'm deleting that now. That's gone. Like, I'm not going to let you play that trick anymore. But yeah, like you were saying, Jack, you know, for people 20 years younger than us, it's their entire lives. Susan, that thing you were talking about internalized surveillance, I found that really fascinating because I find myself doing this as well. I wonder if this is what you're talking about. I write a lot of satire, and it means I quite often have to look up what somebody might have said about something. It might be somebody that I'm not interested in personally, but I want to know what they've said about it because I need the context. What did Karl Marx say about this? Or what has Tommy Robinson said about that? Sorry to put those two in the same sentence.
Okay.
But and sometimes I think my phone knows what I'm, it's gathering all this data. And in a sort of flight of dramatic fancy, my brain will say, a government official now somewhere knows somewhere that you're thinking about this stuff, and there's going to be eyes on you. And that kind of scares me. Yeah. Because you don't know how real it is.
Yeah, and I think more disturbing is if it would stop you doing, like you were just saying, the searches in the first place, or even the thinking in the first place. I mean, there's this other idea, you probably know this better than me as a political theorist, but Herbert Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance, which is that, and I can't quite remember the theory behind it, but it's again the idea that you self-repress before, so there's no such thing as real tolerance or a real open forum, because each person has already sort of, without knowing almost, sort of censored themselves because of what they feel they can or can't say. Now, I don't know if I really believe that, because as I said earlier, you know, in my more optimistic moments and my more utopian moments, I think that, you know, the purpose of literature and writing is to allow people to, well, one of its purposes, another big one is just pleasure, but, you know, one of its purposes is to allow challenge and push back against the status quo and the sort of the accepted ideas. And I think, you know, hopefully we still have that to some extent, you know, not a marketplace of ideas in any sort of naive sense, but just that through writing and through sharing, through some of the local ground level writing platforms that there are, which don't have to go through the big publishing conglomerates, you know, people can self-publish, people can go to book clubs, people can go to creative writing clubs, that there is that ability to push back against, you know, this surveillance state and some of the dystopian ideas that we've just been talking about. I would hope that that's the case still, but I might be naive.
No, I think that makes sense. I also think, you know, Instagram in some ways, sometimes we downplay, especially on the left, I think we downplay the benefits of Uber, the benefits of Airbnb, and all these things that genuinely bring benefits to people. And I think a lot of people are creative in a way of like making sure they've got a nice photo of the cat to put out in a way that, you know, maybe that person wouldn't otherwise in the kind of 70s have had a super creative outlet. So some stuff, although I think we're right to be skeptical of it, I think also, yeah, like self-publishing, a lot of people are able to put stuff out in a way that probably challenges old hierarchies. I mean, one of my concerns at times is that the biggest advocates for kind of free speech and kind of fairly being laissez-faire, you know, just tend to be well-off white Western men, right? So like, you know, Elon Musk can be like, look, let's say what we want and let's say whatever about the streets of Birmingham or Manchester, because Elon Musk doesn't have to be there, right? And you know, if you're I don't know, if you're a young woman, or if you're kind of not, you're in the UK and you're not white, or, you know, we saw what happened over in Harrods and it got blamed on Muslims. But the people that are sharing that stuff generally are people that it comes from a position of power, really. And I think all the good arguments, as far as I'm concerned, about free speech, because I think most of us do believe in some fairly strong form of free speech, but does come with a sense that I also have a responsibility for the impact it has on other people, really. So yeah. Yeah,
and I also think that we have to remember that historically there have been whole parts of the world and groups of people who've had dystopian situations and experiences, you know, way before this, or in other parts of the world, you know, not just historically, but now, and in ways that we're still quite privileged, is what I'm trying to say. So, I mean, there's a really interesting novel which I've been doing some work on. It's called Future Home of the Living God by a Native American woman writer called Louise Erdrich. And she it's a bit like The Handmaid's Tale, but interesting because it's set in an environment of, you know, a Native American. Well, the heroine is half Native American, half white. And it's just sort of bringing in that context that if you're from a history and a culture like that, you know, your life's been dystopian since, you know, the Americas were invaded whenever, you know, by Europeans, because of the way that you've been colonized and treated and so on and so forth. So it is about remembering perspective as well and thinking that there are certain, as you said, sort of privileges that we still have to an extent, and that other people haven't had for a lot longer than that.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the cruxes of the current problem in the West to me, is that a lot of us, especially if you consider yourself fairly liberal, fairly progressive, you would look back at the last 300 years and think, well, look, this is kind of... This is good that we've become so critical of our own past and our own, you know, norms around gender and race. At the same time, there might be something really that we want to defend about liberal democracies, and certain things that have happened that are good, and certain points that we've got to in society that are good. But at the moment, the West is kind of collapsing in on itself in terms of, you know, especially all its intellectuals are very critical of it. I mean, not just intellectuals. It's very, from the left and right, everybody is talking down the West in a way that is very gameable by, you know, foreign powers. I mean, maybe, you know, you see what's happening in the US election with Russian interference. But it kind of feels like we're in a bit of a quandary, really, because you don't want to defend. You don't want to say, look, liberal democracies are great, and like this is, you know, we really need to protect this because this is amazing. Because you want to have some really, I think, you want to have some real admittance that, look, some terrible things have gone on, and you know, the wealth that we are in, you know, the kinds of life that we are able to live, you know, to be able to sit around having conversations like this are partly built on some pretty despicable things. And at the same time, if this collapses, it's not really going to be better for anybody.
And it does feel like it's hanging by a thread. And when, you know, you will sort of look at 50% of America at the moment, it seems quite happy for it to go away, you know, and that seems a concern. I definitely want to talk about Handmaid's Tale before we go, just because I do. But also, Jack, I just wanted to mention one more thing about power. So powerful people, rich people, it seems more and more. So just tell me if I'm imagining this, or whether that's your view that this is coming to a head in some ways. If you're very rich, you're very powerful, you're more likely to be able to protect your wealth. You're more likely to have influence over large populations. You're more likely to be able to get an Oasis ticket if you're very rich. But I wrote that down. I thought, that's a joke. But hang on, no, it's not, because Ticketmaster are making masses of money. It becomes elitist, surge pricing while people are queuing for a concert ticket. And I thought, that's just, it almost feels like capitalism gone wrong in microcosm while people are queuing for a band. How is that something that is becoming, are the powerful becoming more and more powerful, I guess, is the question.
I think what you see from the 70s onwards is, especially in the West, is like increasingly unequal societies. And the one standard argument for that is, you know, post Second World War, we understood that we had some big debt to each other, and we understood that our lives going well was conditional on lives going well for other people. And maybe, you know, some people think that, look, what happened in Germany in the 30s was, you know, if you don't look after people enough, they will start to look, you know, this kind of Hayek argument, that they'll start to look for some kind of strongman that can take on the problems. And I think when you look at the simplistic argument of people like Nigel Farage, something seems like it's going on in which politicians of the centre and maybe centre right, definitely I think centre left, are somehow not able to communicate in a way that's resonating with people, which is leaving a vacuum for people that are making these kind of simple arguments. I think also, if you look at just how libertarian a lot of really pro-tech people are, there is just a bit of a false sense of how good societies are built, I think. You know, when you look at the kind of tax evasion that goes on, all these kind of things, you know, you don't have an internet without really strong public funding. You know, you don't go to the moon without really strong public funding. And so I think, you know, maybe it's just been so long from the kind of Second World War that some people have convinced themselves that they are incredible just off the back of themselves, and we've lost the sense that actually we only all do well if each other does well. So that's what it seems like to me.
Interesting. Let's come towards a close then by talking about Handmaid's Tale, because you are here and we must talk about it. And I mean, I still maintain the first series of Handmaid's Tale, the television adaptation, was the best television I've ever seen, but is also utterly terrifying when you read the book and you look at some of these things that Margaret Atwood came up with, and then you look at them literally happening in the world at the moment. Whether she's smug or not about predicting it, I mean, there's certainly some of that, isn't there? But are these what is going on in the world at the moment when you look at something like Handmaid's Tale, and because it's so big and popular, it seems like a decent one to choose? What are the things you look at and say, that feels a bit like that? And somebody has thought about these things and they figured out that this is a problem and now it's happening. Is it the reproductive? I mean, that obviously.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest, isn't it? It's about reproductive freedom and women's reproductive justice, actually, and women's right to choose what they do with their own bodies. But it's also all the other disturbing aspects about the novel. So the way that religion gets sort of warped and used to impose aspects of power and control that, you know, weren't there in the original text, as it were. So Gilead sort of uses the very selectively aspects of the Old Testament to sort of create this world where the handmaids are forced to have babies for the commanders and their wives. The other thing that I think is really interesting about The Handmaid's Tale is that there has been some backlash on the way that Atwood uses the narratives of enslaved women from the 19th century and sort of incorporates a lot of those ideas, both in the way the novel's written and in what happens in it. So, and there's been some backlash because some people have said she sort of takes what happens in history and in reality to women of African descent who were sort of, you know, enslaved and taken to the USA. She takes their experiences and their narratives, and she sort of, you know, your children being stolen from you, being raped, and being put in a situation where those things are considered entirely normative and so on. And she takes those things and she gives them to the heroine of the novel, of Fred, who is a white woman. And it's because she's white that suddenly this is seen as, you know, dystopian, because it happened in the past, in North America to actual people, but to take it into a sort of future imagined scenario where it's happening to a white woman, it's suddenly becoming sort of really disturbing. So there's been some sort of comment about that, which I think is really interesting. And the TV version did interesting things with that, because obviously in the TV version there are lots of people of colour playing all the different parts. So lots of the handmaids, lots of the wives, lots of the other characters. So it sort of had what you might call, you know, colourblind casting. And that then led to a sort of quite a different set of effects. So I think it's a great novel. I think a lot of the warnings that it contains are really, you know, still entirely important and vivid. I think the way that people have used the costume to protest is fantastic. And Margaret Atwood is on the record as saying that it's a great way of protesting because all you have to do is just put on this costume and sort of stand there. You know, it stands for something. People know what it means. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to be, you know, disruptive. It's a very quiet, silent, but effective protest. So I think the way that the costume gets used in situations of protest is quite effective. But yeah, I do think that, I don't know what I think about what might be called, some people might call it the sort of racial erasure of the novel.
Interesting. It's an aspect I've not thought about. So I've learned more today, and I do need to get a reading list from you, Susan, before you go today.
Anytime.
Loads of books have been mentioned. I thought I can't remember all of these, so I'll get them written down. Thank you so much, the both of you, Susan. Thank you, Jack, as well, for joining us on LIFICAST Episode 1, 2024. Of course, in association with the Leeds International Festival of Ideas, which is on the way very, very soon. And stay with us for an episode 2 as we look ahead to our dystopian, as we look ahead, it sounds odd to say that, but as we look forward to our dystopian future with the YouTuber Mooncad and the author Adrian Tchaikovsky on episode 2 to come in the next few days.